It is now time to put all these elements together into the final comp to enhance and polish and beautify. In other words, it's time for chapter 3, subtitled whatever I called it in the intro, which I at the moment don't recall. Let's start with what we have right in front of us in here. So this is looking pretty good, but it could look better. I'm going to zoom in on one of the polygons created by our blur effect, and I'm looking for one of them that's fairly sharp. Some of them are blurry because the light that they originate from is spread among many pixels. This here is fairly sharp and good to work with. So first thing I want to do is add a bit of a diffraction fringe. So I really like that look on the lens when the edges are brighter and the inside is a bit darker. So I'm just gonna bump this value in here from 100 to 250, and it's a very small difference, but it makes me happy, so I'm gonna keep it. And you can see right now that it's slightly brighter on the edges and slightly less opaque inside. If I would push it to something like 500, it would become much more pronounced, but that's way too much. So 250 it is. The second thing I want to do, and you know, I've been struggling with it from the very beginning, is it still feels quite a bit muddy. It doesn't have all that beautiful, you know, shining light feel to it, and there are two reasons for it. One is that we're still working in 8-bit space, so let's remedy it immediately. I'm just gonna alt click on the 8-bit per channel and pump it up to 16. We don't need to go all the way to 32, that would be too much. And second thing is I'm gonna highlight some of them. So let's collapse some of the settings in here. You know what, while we on the iris properties, this still feels very, come on, render up, very sharp and geometric. I like to increase roundness on those polys. Let's try 25, 26, maybe even 33. And this is starting to look a little bit cuter and a bit softer and more pleasant to the eye. So with the iris all set up, roundness at 33, diffraction at 250, let's jump into the highlight and give it a bit of a gain so that the brightest pixels we have in here will shine a bit more. And I think on my test run I had a gain set to around 50, and you can already see that some of the pixels are picking it up. Not sure if 50 is enough for this. Let's try 75. Okay, this is much nicer. And then let's play with the threshold to adjust it to a better setting. So let's try 30,000. This is probably not enough. Let's try 20,000. And this is starting to nicely pop. I can also increase the saturation to maybe something like 60 to make sure that we don't lose all the color in here. So this is starting to look a bit more punchy. I just want to see what would happen if I went all the way up to, let's say, 100. You know what, it's not bad, but I think 75 was better. Great, so this footage is pretty much ready to go, and let's start putting some liquid on it. So I'm going to skip a step or two in here just for the benefit of illustrating the point and making it easier to understand. Normally I would layer a number of things on top of this, but I'm gonna start with the distortion and then work my way backwards, creating all the other effects. And that's going to help us understand whether all our simulations of raindrops are dense enough and fast enough and thick enough and so on. So we're going to use the distortion map that we created, raindrops distortion map, as our base. And I'm gonna drop it underneath the footage and turn off its opacity. Just like the depth map, raindrop distortion map is there just for the benefit of one of the effects and doesn't need to be seen by the renderer. On top of our footage, I'm going to drop a new adjustment layer. And maybe I can expand it in here so we can see the names a bit better and rename it into distortion. Okay, and I think distortion. Okay, that's totally misspelled. Distortion looks better. And actually it's not distortion, it's displacement. So let me just back up in here. and rename it accordingly. Typing displacement in our search box in here will give us a bunch of effects, and displacement map is the one we're looking for. So let's drop it on our adjustment layer, and you can see that our footage got offset significantly in here. Now that's because it's using itself as the displacement map. But if we switch it to raindrops distortion map and then pump up the values in here, we will start seeing our shapes appearing in the footage. So let's give it a horizontal distortion of, let's say, 25 and vertical of, let's say, 12, and switch it from reading the red value into luminance. And this is really just a cosmetic effect. It doesn't matter because our map is black and white, so all the channels read the same way, but it's going to help us see it correctly and not mix up any additional values. On top of that, I'm gonna click warp pixels around. We already cleaned up the edges with a matte on our distortion map, but just in case, it's good to have it on. So we can now see that some stuff is starting to appear on our footage. We're getting some sort of snaking, but it's still very, very abstract. And the problem with it is that we're moving pixels of this blurry abstract composition. So what I want to do right now is drop in a sharp version of the footage underneath these pixels to give it something more sharp and more identifiable to distort. And since we're going to be operating with multiple copies of the same original layer, let's rename them a bit in the composition. So in here we have City Shimmer, and I'm gonna add to it out of focus. Then I can grab another copy of it. So City Shimmer, drop it on top, and that's the sharp one, and I'm gonna call it City Shimmer inside drops. So right now it's showing everywhere full screen, and it looks a bit weird because we still have that displacement running on top. So let's turn it off for a moment, and now we can mask it with our raindrops matte. So let's drop a raindrops matte on top and use luminosity matte. So luma matte raindrops matte, and then turn displacement on again. And now it's starting to look like something. Let's zoom in a bit and see if we're distorting it enough or too much. And it looks like it's way too much actually. We're pushing those pixels all the way to the edge and we can barely see what's happening to it. So let's go back to the displacement and lower the values by about half. So I'm going to change this to 14 and this to, let's say, 8. And this is starting to look a bit more interesting. I think now we have too much of it. So, you know, it's a balance game. We need to just find a right number that's gonna look fine. This is probably way too much, but 10 and 18 seem to work just about right. And this doesn't really matter whether we're stretching the map or centering it. The map is exactly the same size. So this is starting to look like something. Now, one of the things I don't like about it is how sharp the edges of our long streaking drops are. And that's because we need to blur them a bit more. So let's go into Raindrops Matte, open it up, and you may remember we already dropped Fast Blur on top of Raindrops Dynamic at the value of 2. Let's increase it to, let's say, 5 and see if this helped. Rain Main, and yes, they're starting to look a bit softer, look a bit more glassy. Now, I still don't like the directionality of it and how it's pumping up to the top. So maybe I can change the vertical displacement to -10, and this way I'm catching all the stuff in the bottom. So this is starting to look pretty fine. Now, there is a certain caveat that I have to give to this composition. This is not how the raindrops work. In real life, each raindrop is a miniature lens that is going to reflect the entire image by its own. So if our camera is set to focus on the pane of glass, we would see all the city out of focus in the background, but inside each of the drops we would see a perfectly sharp upside down distorted version of the city. Now, creating something like that in After Effects would be requiring a significant calculational power. We would probably have to create particles where each of them represents the whole image. It would be a bit of a nightmare. So we're approximating the same effect simply by applying something sharp, something recognizable inside the dots. And to a casual eye, this is gonna look perfectly realistic. The second thing is, if I pull back right now, I can see that I definitely underplayed the amount and the size of all the elements. The drops are very sparse. It doesn't really feel like it rained for a lot. It feels like the window already started drying up after the rain. So we're gonna try to punch those numbers in just a moment. Before we play with the amount of drops on the screen, let's create a visual counter to what right now we're seeing. So for each raindrop and for each streak, we have this dark distortion happening on the left, but the right is just fading into the background. So I want to create a secondary distortion on each of the drops to give it a bit more of a light and dark play and give it more dimensionality. And to do that, I'm going to grab this rain main composition that we're working on, create a copy of it, and then rename it immediately into light drops. So this is gonna be the light version of the raindrops. Let's open this composition up, and it looks identical, of course, because it's a pure copy. I'm going to turn off the out of focus city altogether, leaving us with only the distorted version, and play with the displacement. So I'm just going to shift it to the opposite side, and instead of pushing it downwards, I'm gonna push it upwards by, let's say, maybe 20. So this is looking fairly fine. If I come back right now, I can drop this light drops on top of everything in here. So I'm dropping it on top of our displacement as well, and switch it into additive mode. And right now it's definitely starting to look like water, definitely looking like liquid, especially when we zoom out and maybe preview a small fragment of it. So let's just have a look at whether those drops look believable or not. So yes, it's definitely starting to get there, but it's not quite there yet. And one of the reasons is, as I said before, the raindrops are way too small and way too sparse, so they feel like little buttons rather than pools of liquid. And it goes both for the static and dynamic ones. So let's tweak the settings really quickly and see what will be the result. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lock in the rain main composition, so again we can preview what's happening in here and maybe even give it a bit more real estate on our screen and zoom in to 100%. That's going to significantly slow down our renders, but also give us a chance to observe it much better. And let's start digging in and adjusting all the settings. So first I would probably want to sort out our static drops. So let's open the static drops, and for some reason it decided to jump into another composition. Okay, I need to open it up a bit and figure out the settings. So first of all, I want quite a few more of those drops on the screen, and we are at 7,500. I'm gonna pump it up to 20,000. All right, let's see how this looks. It's going to take a while to calculate, and it's starting to look better, but it's not quite there yet. Let's check the size of the particles and change it to perhaps something like 18. This is not bad. You see, right, some of them are starting to merge right now, and this creates a cool effect. And actually what I did was I changed the life, not the size, I think, yes. And why don't we pump it up to 100 so that they all stay alive. I have no idea why they are disappearing right on the first frame, but let it be. Size is here, size is 12, so I'm gonna change it to 16. Okay, now we're talking. Something is happening, and you can see how we're getting very, very liquidy look in some of the spots where all the dots kind of join together. This is getting much, much better. I'm gonna pull back The problem right now is all the dots are quite similar in size, so I'm going to change size random from 25 to something like 60, generating a bit more variation in here. Maybe even more, maybe even 80. And then we can push back the size a bit to, let's say, 15, maybe even 14. This is pretty cool. Let's have a look at our particle itself. So it is a sphere and it has a feather on it. What would happen if we minimize the feather to 0? We actually get something that looks much more like a drop of water. So maybe instead of very high feather, so at 100 it totally looks like a bubble, let's change it to, let's say, 10. This way it's fairly soft. Okay, 10 may be a bit too little. Let's try 15. There we go. It's starting to look like a drop of water. And now with the more defined edges, we can probably dial back on the size again. How about we actually try to bring it all the way back to 12? You know what, not happy with 12. 14, and this is a lot of back and forth in here. We just need to find the right number. I'm going to decrease the amount of particles from 20,000 to 15,000. That should clean it up quite a bit. And perhaps change the emitter size, the depth of emitter size a bit. Let's do 1,000 on this one. So right now I'm increasing the depth at which the particles are generated to give it a bit more of scale difference. Okay, this is starting to look cool. I may try to cycle through a few random seeds just to see what happens. And probably dial down the number, dial down the size. Let's try 10. 10 is too little. I think I had it right in the beginning. 12 seems to be the magic number in here. Okay, and how about this feather of the sphere? Okay, I'm satisfied with this, for sure. Now, unfortunately, as we increase the drops, we kind of lost our streaks. And I'm curious what would happen. And as I said, this is a lot of experimentation. If we punched the amount of those dots into something ridiculous, like 35,000, you know what? It's not that ridiculous at all. I think something like 40,000 combined with much smaller particles could just do the trick. So let's go back to 8, and there we go. This is starting to look like water. Okay, I'm definitely happy with this. Last thing, I want to check if adding some random opacity would make it more interesting, and yes, indeed it does. So let's push randomness to 50 and maybe lower the default to 75. Cool. All right, I consider the static dots a success. Reds right now play a bit, you know what, 85. Let's right now play with the dynamic ones. So we can close those off, open up the dynamic composition, and again, go to rain main, stupid name, go to rain main and preview it live as we tweak the values. So the first thing I want to do is make sure that our streaks are a bit thicker. Let's go to aux system, find the parameter for the size. It's 12. Let's try to pump it to 15. This makes them much stronger, much more visible. Let's push forward in time a bit. They could be longer. I feel like they're not quite there in terms of length. They still feel a bit insignificant. So that would be affected by changing the life of the aux system. And I'm gonna go all the way to 6. And this is now starting to look like something I was looking for. This is pretty cool. Now I would still like to have a bit more of a distortion in the movement of those particles. I feel like they're still kind of snaking very smoothly. So for that I would have to go to physics, air, turbulence field, and figure out some settings. So how about we go to the scale of 10 again. And what happened? Did I switch something off? Yep, closed it somehow, and increase the complexity to 3. And this actually looks much more realistic right now. So what happened is, as I decreased the complexity earlier on, we got less noise in the movement of those particles, resulting in something that just felt a bit too curvy and too smooth. Now with the additional movement, it looks just a bit more random, like the pattern that the water would create on the surface of the glass. What would happen if I punch the position to 150? You know, this is not bad. A bit much, maybe 125. And let's leave it at that. So this is definitely way on its way to looking good. I'm really happy with the density and the movement on the particles. Right now is just a few more steps, some of them to add a bit more realism, and some of them just to make it look a bit more beautiful. Not necessarily realistic, but just cooler. So let's start with the cool part, and this is the effect that most people, including myself really, consider quite cheesy, but we're going to use Trapcode Starglow. So let's go to the light drops that we created, that additional layer with the top right reflections, and apply Starglow on top of it. And you know what, we can actually do that not here, but in our main composition. So here are our light drops. Let's apply Starglow to it and just tweak it to look good, and you can already see it kicking in. And the cool part about it is it's going to only affect some of the brightest pixels. Now this of course looks absolutely dreadful. The colors don't match our look, but if you switch to one of the Cold Heaven presets, and I think it's either Cold Heaven 1 or 2, let's see, I think Cold Heaven 1 is pretty fine, and then tweak some of the settings, this is going to add just a tiny bit of polish and look to it. So let's go to pre-process, increase the threshold a little bit, so maybe 200. Will that make it disappear? No, that starts to pick up only the brightest elements. We can soften it a bit so that it's not so sharp. Boost the light. Let's see if we boost it by 5. This is still fine. And play with the streak length. Now this always confuses me, so I need to play with it a tiny bit until I get the right number. This actually seems to look pretty fine. Let's try 15. We don't need a shimmer because it's in the constant movement. And let me see what would happen if I just keep on playing with the threshold. If I lower it down, this is way too much. If I increase it to something like 225, this is actually pretty cool. We don't want too much of that glow effect. Let's see if we can now boost the light a lot. Yes, we can. This is pretty cool. Alright, but I'm going to lower this down to 30, increase the streak length to maybe 30 as well, or maybe not, 12, and lower the threshold to 215. Cool, this is looking pretty good. So this is the cheesy part done, and let's now move on to some of the realistic elements. Okay, screw realism. I paused the video recording for a moment and played with the settings, and there is a better way of adjusting the Starglow. So threshold down to 175, which gives us many more streaks. Then threshold soft to 45 to soften it up so we don't have quite so many sharp little pieces, and then lowering the boost light to something like 5, and that gives us a bit more of a soft, dreamy quality when it feels more like a prism. And let's have a look one more time at the Cold Heaven 2 and keep it. Yeah, this is pretty nice. Maybe we can even lower the boost to 0 right now. Yeah, this still looks fine. Alright, so now onto the realism. So typically when you have rain on the window and condensation like that, that means there is a significant difference in the temperature between indoors and outdoors. And what happens to the windows then? They fog. So let's add a bit of fogging, because honestly speaking, everything is a bit too sharp in this composition. So let's open it up a bit, grab our city shimmer out of focus, create a copy of it, so duplicate, and add a fast blur on top. So fast blur, and blur just the hell out of it. So I'm gonna go to like 250. This is pretty good. I'm gonna have to repeat the edge pixels and then add a mask, because of course we don't want everything matted, although this is looking pretty cool in its own right. So I'm going to switch to ellipse tool, double click it, then reverse the mode from add to subtract, and pretty much we're starting to get it. I can probably dial it in a bit, and if I remove the fast blur, the ellipse is gonna get a sharper edge as well. Well, the camera lens blur as well. This is basically what we're masking, and this is our final look. So let's get this mask expansion and pull it back by, let's say, 50 pixels. Let's see what happens if I pull it by 150. Okay, that's a bit much, but you know, mine is 125 with the lowered transparency should work. So transparency, let's bring it down to something like 70% and switch the mode into add actually. And then on top of this brightened additive mode, I'm gonna make another copy with the same settings, but switch this mode to normal. And that's our effect without the fog. And that's with the fog. Now it's still a bit strong here on the around the edges, so I should continue playing with the opacity. If I go down to 50 on both of them, that's probably gonna give me slightly better result. And this part was already blurring quite a lot even without it. So you see, even with my new fogging removed, in here we have not much detail, everything is blurry. So let's bring this back in. Okay, this is looking pretty cool. Another thing that I see right now, the more I look at the image, is I'm not entirely happy with the way the composition works. So the negative space is kind of weird. We have a lot of concentration of stuff here in kind of top left center zone, but our right edge and the bottom edge are absolutely boring. So I'm going to dig deep in and try to fix it right now. So let's go to the city plate, right? And this is our basic image. And I'm just gonna move it about a bit. So let's push it just about here and maybe scale it up a tiny bit. So this gives much more space to the city, and I think it was this house that was actually messing things up, as well as too much of that street. So this would be our new orientation, and then we don't need this, we don't need this, we don't need this, and then what would be the next one? City shimmer. We need to readjust our lights, so I'm gonna switch off the fractal noise for a moment, turn off most of the flares, and just go one by one repositioning them. So this is not really attached to anything, so I'm just gonna put it here in the corner, let it flare up. When we're out of focus, it will feel like it comes from some significant source. Flare red, I believe this was on the top, whoops, this was on the top of Transamerica building, so let's move it there. There we go. This was one of the twin flares on the building right next to it, so let's zoom in and move it around. This is one, and this is two. And again, I'm doing it because I want to be correct with the geometry, but honestly speaking, with all the other effects, the blurs and the distortions, nobody would even know if those flares don't match their original light sources. Let's keep going. We have this, and I think there were twin lights. Yep, on this triangular building. So let's grab one of them, move it here, another one, and move it there. And the final light, I remember being somewhere down on the left. Right now it's attached to the edge of the building. I think it was supposed to be there. Great. Okay, so all this is rearranged. And you know what? I'm gonna save because I didn't do it in a while again. And let's roll back and see how it looks right now. Okay, so I think it's much more interesting. There's more stuff happening. The fog makes more sense right now. And overall, the effect is much cooler. Now, the only thing I'm not quite happy with is how thick those big streaks are. They feel really bulky and almost out of place compared to all the other little raindrops. So I may want to go into my raindrops matte and see what would happen if I lowered the opacity of those guys. So let's go to raindrops dynamic and see what if I switch the opacity to 75. What if I made it 50? And I find it usually useful to go overboard with the values just to get a better feeling. So I now know where it goes if I go all the way to 25, and that's nothing interesting. But let's compare 70 and 100. And you know what? 70 feels much more natural. It feels like it belongs in the same world with all the other drops. So I'm gonna keep it right there. One more thing I can do is maybe play with this original displacement and just lower the horizontal value a bit, or increase it actually. Oh yeah, increase it to give it a bit more edge, a bit more sharpness in there. And this is pretty cool because you can really see the results right there as you play with the settings. So I think something around 30 could work here. And how about this one? I think -10, -11 was just fine. Okay, so we have our fog, we have our rain. The whole thing is progressing nicely. Now, if you recall the beginning of the tutorial when I was walking you through the assets we have, I also have some of this messy kind of grungy textures that we can grab on top. So let's try to do this right now. I'm gonna grab the hand sticker and just drop it here. And it should go right on top of displacement because it is in front of it from our point of view. The water is on the other side of glass. So actually it should go in front of everything probably. Let's put it on top of everything. And hello. Okay. Switch it to additive mode. Move it to somewhere where it makes sense. And lower the opacity until it's barely visible. So something like 5%. Probably even less, but I can take it out of focus a bit. So again, fast blur, repeat edge pixels, and blur it by, let's say 10 maybe even more, maybe 20. Cool, and let's do that to a couple more. So I'm just gonna solo it, turn off the transparency grid so I can see what's happening, make a copy, and then replace the copy with, let's say, this hand. Okay, and I can move it around and position it perhaps here. I'm gonna scale it up so that it doesn't get clipped anywhere, and make one more layer and use this peeling effect on it. Now peeling will disappear completely once we blur it too much, so I'm gonna lower the blur and increase the opacity just a bit to something like 11%. And maybe just reset the position. So let's reset this and then lower the opacity. Okay, and this is looking pretty cool. Let's switch off the solo mode and see how does it play with the rest of our layers. And it's barely visible in there, but it really serves a function. It really helps us ground this file and introduce some elements that just feel like a lens. I just want to try really quickly what would happen if I dropped it underneath our distortion and it's not too bad. And what would happen if I keep on dropping it down? So perhaps dropping it underneath the first layer of raindrops. So this allows us to bring back that black layer, and that's actually quite useful. Underneath City Shimmer it will probably disappear completely. So what I can do is put the hands, which are quite big, underneath everything, and then put the peeling on top, and this will create quite nice layering in there with a lot of different interesting tastes. And probably now that I see it all together, I can lower the opacity just a bit into 4. So I think we can drop another adjustment layer on top of everything and just work from there to put those final touches right now. And let's create that. And I keep on forgetting what's the shortcut for the adjustment layer. Perhaps because it's all different variations of the letter Y with a number of modifiers. Null, adjustment, solid, it's all the same combinations. So I'll call it a final touches. And the first thing I want to do is blur it. And why I will do it is, let's go to 100% zoom and have a quick look. Well, not so quick, but have a look at what we're seeing. It's looking pretty nice, but it feels very digital. It still doesn't have that natural feel, and that's because, you know, everything is rendered so perfectly, and you have those, you know, immaculate details in here that only CG renderer would get. So if I now apply fast blur to my final touches layer and just blur it by 1 pixel, it's gonna soften it up ever so slightly and give it a bit more of a believable look. And I'm of course turning on repeat edge pixels to make sure that it all feels right. Let's see if 0.5 would be a better choice. You know what? I think it is. So we don't need to blur it by an entire pixel, but just adding it a bit of softness helps us get rid of this artifacts, this digital look. Isn't it this super sharpness that we're getting on some of the elements, and just blend it all together and make it soft and cohesive. So this would be the first thing. The second thing is I feel like we're still kind of all over the place in terms of color. And this is kind of normal because we have so many sources of light and different, you know, shining flares and then the colorful city. But let's try to unify it. So I'm gonna create a new solid, call it a color ramp, and just apply a gradient on it. So let's see what colors we could choose. Probably for the top, we're gonna go with some sort of blue, and I'm choosing very, very vibrant, very strong colors here. Let's make it invisible, and for the bottom I want something from this family of violets or pinks, but again I'm gonna push it quite to the limit. And this could be wrong, we'll see in a moment, but once I apply it, and I'll probably need to change this color very quickly because it's just taking over the whole thing very quickly. Let's push it back and switch it to the color mode. Where do we have color mode? Here. And then start dialing back on the opacity, somewhere around probably 15%. It will just glaze over the footage and give it a bit more of a cohesive look. So this is without it, this is with it. It just feels right. It just feels like an additional layer of color on top that helps us unify the whole thing. We can actually put this thing underneath the final touches, and I'm just gonna quickly see what happens if I go with normal mode. Unfortunately, normal mode kind of kills the contrast a bit, but I'm gonna keep it just to try something else. I have fast blur already on final touches. The last thing I want to do is some curve adjustment. So let's turn on curves, drop them in, and see if we can now crunch the contrast with this color ramp included to make it look good. And I think actually we can. So I'm going to pull this back a bit, ramp up to the bright colors and make them a bit more punchy, and maybe even create a bit of an S curve. And this is probably too much right now. Yes, so I can cut this from this layer create yet another, and I should remember it by now. Let's try Ctrl Alt Y. Yes, new adjustment layer. So let's call it final curves. Paste this effect, and now I can play with its intensity using transparency. So, you know, this is the balancing game, trying to make sure it looks good but doesn't overwhelm the footage. What would it look like if I switched this back to, let's say, overlay? You know, this is not bad, but probably hue or color would be better. Now I can't decide. I think hue is pretty good. Yeah, because hue just dims down some of the warmer spots. Yay! Okay, back to 15. And then the final curves. Let's just find that sweet spot. Probably around 50%. Okay. And you know what? I'm just gonna quickly cycle to see if introducing 32-bit or 8-bit would make any significant difference. So let's go to 8-bit first. It will take a moment to re-render. It's probably gonna become much more dull and uninteresting. And you know, it's barely perceivable, but it's not quite as vibrant and quite cool. Back on the 16, we get a bit more punch, and what happens at 32? Is it worth it? You know what? I would argue it's actually worth it. We get a lot of really nice hot burn in here. Unfortunately, we would have to readjust our settings a bit, so let's just take this curve down, open it up a bit, and maybe not burn the lights quite so much, but just a bit. And then get that color ramp and find just the right setting for it. You know what? 15 was good. And this is pretty sweet. So, all right, this is save. This is, I think, our final look. And what I'm gonna do right now is render it up and get back to you once it's ready and we can have a look at it. And here is our final render, or rather a half resolution proxy I rendered to save some time. Am I happy with it? Definitely. Would I tweak it further? If I had enough time. You know, the work of motion designer and VFX artist is never really finished. You can tweak your compositions to infinity, and I think sometimes it's very important to know when to call it, and from what I see, this is pretty much there. This is pretty good. So I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. You had a good time and been entertained. This has been one of the longest ones, I guess. I just looked at the material I recorded, so before editing we're clocking at around 3 hours. So I guess once I tighten it up a bit, we're gonna still have around 2.5 hours worth of material. So I'm gonna chop it up into 3 separate chapters, which you already know if you reached it that far in the video. Either way, I hope you enjoyed watching it and learned something today. I'm not yet sure what is going to be the topic of the next tutorial. I'll probably pick something slightly easier and more digestible, just to keep it varied and well, just to release it sooner, to be honest, because this one took quite a while to prepare. Either way, for QubaHQ Tutorials, I've been Kuba Michalski, and I'll see you next time.